Welcome again, everyone. If you just joined to this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and for the right to return, as Dr. Neber just reminded us, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide, a century in the making, and most recently, horrifically accelerated. Please feel free to join us to come and go over the course of these 2 days as you can, as you wish. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I'm really grateful to be welcoming Dr. Edwin Mayorga. Dr. Mayorga is Associate Professor in the program in Latin American and Latino Studies and Chair of the Department of Educational Studies at Swarthmore College. Among numerous other projects, he's the founder of Education in Our Barrios project and created the Critical Education Policy Studies Group. An expert in critical curricula, we welcome Dr. Mayorga today to talk about teaching for a free Palestine, against colonization, occupation, and genocide, and across colonial projects. Dr. Mayorga, we're really so thankful for your contributions to our shared work today. And I will say I initially reached out to you because you shared the Zinn Project curriculum guide on teaching Palestine, in both the history of colonization and the history of people, culture, language, knowledge, etc. So I'm wondering if you might jump in where you wish and help us think about what makes liberatory curriculum and pedagogy in these times.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina, and the Center for Urban Education and Pitt for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Can you all hear me okay? Just wanting to make sure. So I did want to also take a moment I'm speaking to you all from Haudenosaunee land here in Montreal, Canada, and where I typically reside with my family in the heritage and ongoing lands, unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape. So I wanted to just make sure that I recognize and acknowledge that, but also see it as an invitation to think about settler colonialism more broadly, and in relation to Palestine. And I think more than anything, part of the reason, my motivations for sharing what Zinn Education Project had created, and there are so many, wonderful pieces of curriculum, is my own deep desire to thinking about how we teach through the weight of history, the weight of loss, of devastation. I will say also, just that, not as an aside, but I did also want to add that my heart goes out also to each and every one of you who are participating here as audience members and as speakers. This is a extremely difficult time for many of us. We've lost loved ones, or we are supporting and working with friends and colleagues who have, or they themselves have lost loved ones. And so I think we need to consistently and continually sit with that and think as educators as to what that means for us and what responsibilities we need to take on, not just as educators for social justice, but I think all of us as educators, not only in the formal classroom, but as parents, as community educators, as peers and friends. There's always this kind of pedagogical dynamic that we need to attend to and take very seriously, rather than kind of, be flip about it and seeing it as not, perhaps in some ways, not essential to, when tragedy is happening in the moment, it feels difficult to stop and think, well, actually, we need to be teaching here as much as we are attending to the harm and the violence that that is being that we're witnessing, and for some of us experiencing ourselves directly. And so where does teaching fit into this? Is what motivates me, and motivates a lot of the questions that I'm thinking about. So in my commentary, I wanted to actually just kind of talk us through some of our kind of pedagogical kind of thoughts that I had. As there is no one. I know, Sabina, you and I are educators and deeply invested in that, and so I think we both, and many of us who are here know, right? There is no one silver bullet, this is going to save everyone kind of approach. So what I want to share are my thoughts on one potential approach that I've gathered in listening and staying attuned to what's happening and how people are talking about what's happening right now in and around Gaza. But also then thinking about my own experience as an educator, as well as an organizer and as a parent. How do all these three pieces, how do I navigate those things? And in particular, thinking about the ways that much of this feels, for those of us in North America, much of this feels as if it's something that is far away. And so we as teachers, I think it's critical for us to think about, how do we teach something that feels far away, or that it is safer for us to treat it as something far away, rather than actually stopping to look and attend to, in fact, it's right here, right? Whether it be through people and family and neighbors, or direct relationships that we have, or our own histories, right? Myself as a child of immigrants from Latin America and Asia, what in fact does this mean for us? What are the histories and ways that in which there are overlapping long loops of time and processes, and sitting with the atrocities that have shaped what in fact is happening to our own communities and our own loved ones, and seeing those connections and through points. And my hope is that in thinking about these steps that I'll talk through, is thinking ultimately about solidarity. What in fact does solidarity look like? How do we teach towards solidarity? And how do we facilitate that for ourselves, as well as the young people, or whatever age group of person you want, the person that you are trying to reach and engage with, whomever that is. What's the henceforward in terms of teaching towards that, rather than the assumption that I think that there's just, I think we sit with a kind of pessimism that things will never change. And I'm trying to I'm inviting us to flip the script on that, and to really think about, actually, solidarity is possible. And we in fact have had long histories of solidarity, but they have often been histories that are denied to us. So how do we unpack some of those things? So I'm also taking some of this from some of this work around brave community, brave conversation that Jadine Denoves has developed. And so, I'm taking some of those strategies around, and she recently, I'll share in a moment, just she recently shared a piece around why we struggle with, how do we better facilitate talking about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, what's happening now, but also situating it historically when we're in classrooms. So I'll share that link in a moment. So that my colleague Jen Bradley at Swarthmore, who had pointed it to me, and that was also coming from Adrienne Maree Brown. So want to cite our sources. But Denoves talks about the idea of pre-work. So you in your context, right? And so, Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz talks about this notion of the archaeology of the self, which I think is critically important in instances where we are looking at deeply controversial and deeply polarized kinds of catastrophes and events that are happening in society, in the world, globally. And so really, before we even engage and start to contemplate engaging our students in thinking about that, what kind of self-work do we need to be doing? And that includes both kind of social, emotional, our own kind of well-being and what we are in a position to take on. Because teachers are humans too, contrary to some students' beliefs. Um, and uh, but alongside that, then grounding us in what history do we know, what history has been denied to us of this particular conjuncture and moment, um, and more specifically zeroing in on Palestine is um, and there's a lot of conversation at I'm at the American Studies Association conference, and so there's a lot of conversation happening right now. And one of the important points that I had been thinking about and was affirmed actually in just the talk I was just at just before joining all of us here, um, the question of Palestinian exceptional, like it's treated as this exception rather than situated within history and time. And so when I'm reading articles about settler colonialism is not an accurate description of what's happening. I think it was a piece in the Atlantic. I bristled at it because I'm like, well, what are we talking about here? What's our understanding of what settler colonialism or other forms of imperialism and colonialism and empire that are circulating in the larger kind of landscape and discourse? How are we thinking about that? And I think that how do we step away from that ourselves and starting to think about, okay, we need to know more, right? I need to know more because this is not that's not in our textbooks here in North America. Typically, it's not in everyday conversation. It's a very, the misinformation, the very kind of one-sidedness of conversation leads us to having very let me call it malnourished understandings of the entire situation. And so we foreclose the possibility of, we just describe it as, oh, well, that seems kind of like a landmine of a conversation. There's too much, it's too complex of an issue to wrap our heads around. And that to me seems to be a kind of cop out rather than actually jumping into it as teachers to say, this is critical. This is what's happening in our world right now. And there's so many deep connections to the past. And so we need to do deeper dives, engage in conversations ourselves before we even start to think about it. So that's step zero, right? Like before we even get to planning and thinking about something. And I've got four more steps. So step one then is once you've done that kind of as you're doing that self work, and I don't think that work never ends per se. We have to be comfortable with knowing that that work is ongoing. And so at some point you reach a point where feel that you're better prepared to engage others in your students in these kind of conversations or whomever you're trying to reach. So step one then is really to do similar kind of grounding work with them, asking ourselves, if it's our classrooms, what kinds of practices of everyday practices of living and moving at what Adrienne Maree Brown and others have talked about as moving at the speed of trust. Have we created a context in which having a conversation about something that is seen as very polarizing can be easily seen, or not easily, but just seen and understood as, yes, this is complex, but we trust each other enough to engage in a conversation and multiple conversations, deeper study of an issue, and taking into, being accountable to, while this may not be directly something that I am involved in as a young person, I see that as a member of this world, we are all implicated in it. And what then is our accountability, right? And so really thinking about what, in fact, those things, kind of grounding ourselves in that. I also think, I want to point to one other thing here in this step is the importance of practicing as we are talking about issues and people being directly affected is that, and and I think it goes back to this point around exceptionalism of Palestine rather than seeing it in context, is how important it is to not to treat all life, right, all living beings as sacred. And so we often talk about here in this context in particular, right? We're talking about the importance of humanization, and I say yes to that, but also stretching us to think about all living things, right? As when we're talking about land back or ecosystems, entire environments, right? We're talking about living entities, living things on the planet in relation to humans, right? So I'm, kind of taking this more ecological perspective on it, that it's an entire ecosystem that we are a very fragile ecosystem that we're talking about. So when colonization happens, not as an event, as Patrick Wolf reminds us, but as the structure, that everything is impacted by that ecosystem. We feel it in our bodies, we feel it in our spirits, but we also feel it in the very land in which we are walking on. The water, who has access to that, who does not? And so there's all this kind of environmental piece to it. So we need to, and from my perspective, as we're grounding ourselves, continue to remember that life, in fact, is sacred. So that's step one. We did step 0, step 1. Step 2, thinking about, okay, when we are actually engaging in these conversations, how do we support what happens next, is what Denoves talks about. In what ways have we, again, moving at the speed of trust, how are we emotionally centering ourselves? How do we create and invite inquiry and question without, in ways that colleagues of mine at an organization in Philadelphia called Creative Praxis describe as being full of value but free of judgment. What kind of space does that require for us to invite, open up questions, allow students, who have a kind of general curiosity about what's happening, to ask questions in a way that doesn't feel like they are about to instigate or initiate a question, or I'm sorry, an issue or contention and strife around it, but rather needing to want to learn more and opening up that space. And then the other piece to this in terms of supporting what happens is thinking about practicing how we sit with diverging views. What in fact needs to happen in order for us to sit with views that will sometimes put, just kind of make us kind of bristle. How do we sit with that? How do we stay in the conversation, protect ourselves, but then at the same time, open to pushing back, to listening, and in being engaged in that, and holding on to what we believe to be your particular approach. Step 3 then is thinking about modeling bravery and accountability. So things, in conversations as educators, when you open up these kinds of conversations, there's a chance it's going to fall off, run off the rails. And so how do we bring us back, right? How do we listen attentively when we name, okay, there's a tension happening here, or some of us are starting to escalate our voices and we as facilitators identifying that and not dismissing it, but rather thinking about, well, let's step back and think about what's behind that, right? Maybe we feel very impassioned about our perspective, or maybe you feel harmed by a diverging perspective, or maybe it feels like we're kind of rudderless in what this conversation is, or this area of study and conversation is where it's going. And so being prepared to, like, how do we bring people back, right? And ourselves back into the conversation, holding each other accountable, and helping us to continue to be brave in these difficult conversations. The final piece in step 4 is moving to action. So I think one of the key things, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the importance of disrupting the cynicism. And I appreciated Nadine's point about the normalization of colonization and the pretenses of neutrality. it happens, right? We have these serious conversations, and then it kind of ends, and so people are just elated it's over, rather than stopping to think, um, uh, that conversations and study is actually the beginning. It's about stopping to think about, well, what's the henceforward, right? What is next? And where do we fit in that larger global next? And so that's where I think we can move from disrupting cynicism, disrupting that normalization, and moving towards solidarity. And I also want to just problematize, and this is where I'll end. I think is, um, we want to problematize as well what we mean by solidarity, because colonization has also framed what we are even thinking about as possible in solidarity, right? And so, um, thinking about what solidarity looked like in Palestine 2 decades ago, 4 decades ago, right, means something very different to what solidarity means to us right now. And whether or not we have even, um, it absolutely should be centered in what's coming from Palestine and the Palestinian people, but then in relationship to the rest of us, right, who are outside of the actual geographic zone, um, how are we attending to emerging definitions of solidarity? There are different needs, right? And the fact that everything is on social media and here we are online having this conversation, it means that solidarity, like even this, like how do we see this space that we have, that you all have facilitated here, as an opportunity, a window for solidarity work, and meaning making and relationship building. And that's different from, even 20 years ago when I was teaching, second graders, or we were talking about September 11th, right? It was a different time. And so there are different moments. And yet there's that deep desire for connection, right? For support. And so how do we channel those things into our contemporary moment to not have predetermined or foreclosed definitions of solidarity, but actually saying, you know what, we need to stop and think about what in fact does this look like for us right now, right? And how then ultimately, and I'm sorry, I lied. I had one more thing to say. And how do we move then from solidarity to radical kind of futures, right? Transformative futures, because that too has been shaped by colonization, right? So when we're saying land back, for example, in indigenous movements, native movements, and I think similarly here, um, it does not, it has a different definition, a different meaning to us as to what this means and what's possible. And then thinking beyond that, it's like, okay, this is what has been kind of defined as possible, and maybe I'll say the word palatable, for structures of power, to say, okay, yeah, we could do this. But really stopping to think about, well, what's just beyond that? What, perhaps a more just world, a more caring and loving world is what's desired. And we don't maybe have the language. We've been, because of colonization, we don't have the language to name and visualize it quite yet. But let's be in that conversation. Let's talk about what that transformative future looks like, because there will come a day, and I hope very soon, right, where there's a ceasefire, right, just to start. And so, well, what's the work after that? Because in many ways, that is just the beginning. And so, I invite and welcome us as educators to really stop and think, and invite our students to think about what is that, let's stop, let's end the violence, but and at the same time be in the process of thinking about a more just and loving future. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Edwin. Do you have a couple minutes? I know we had a 4 o'clock. Okay. I want to reflect back to you and to everyone on this call that I always appreciate how deeply collective you are. And even in this conversation, sort of, the ease, because it's your regular practice with which you weave in so many other people and traditions, and sort of modeled for us in teaching us, also modeled for us a way to teach collectively, even when we're one person in a conversation. So I appreciate that very much. I also appreciated two things. Well, I appreciate everything you said, but two things you said about solidarity, I think, at the beginning and at the end. And yeah, you reminded me of, the famous James Baldwin remarks when he said, of course we're demanding the impossible. That's all we've ever done. And that impossible, if we are we there?
Can you all hear me?
Yes. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
I'm sorry. Yeah, now I can hear you. So you were saying, Sabina, I'm going to stay off camera just because I think it's
a hotel thing.
there's something happening here. Yeah, I'm sorry, all. I'm sorry, y'all.
Probably here too. I think just that idea that we do the impossible by doing it together.
Yes.
The other thing I heard you say that many people have been in conversation about is that solidarity is about the moment, and I really appreciated you pointing to the way in which solidarity with Palestine looks different over time, and that in this moment there's a very particular, we're being asked in very specific direct ways to repost, to repeat chants, to put our bodies out in rallies and protests. So very specific, consistent requests for kinds of solidarity, to have conversations. And I think you modeled that. So I just appreciate your sort of pedagogy, how to meta pedagogy for us today, and really grateful for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate that that's been communicated. Because you sometimes sit in the Zoom box and you're wondering, who am I? Am I communicating what I hope to communicate? And I think definitely that's it. It's about our practice, and it's an everyday practice. So I appreciate that. I did also want to take one last moment too. There was a statement that that Dr. Subanianama and others have put together that I'm deeply appreciative of being invited to participate in that statement. But an Educators for Palestine statement has been crafted, and we are gathering signatures from educators both in higher ed and beyond. So I believe that's the right one in the chat. But definitely want to invite those of you who are on here to join us in that if you are supportive of that. I think much of my remarks are about the classroom, and that's how deeply entangled it is with what's happening beyond the classroom. We as educators, and much of my work as an activist educator has been about understanding that the struggle for justice doesn't end when the school bell rings. As a longtime New York Collective of Radical Educators member, and so in what ways are we both active in our classrooms, but also stretching ourselves and being active in our communities? So I definitely want to encourage people to sign on if they're so moved.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for your work.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your session. And definitely come back Monday, because there's some awesome, dope people coming in on there too. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.